The Perdue family is the fourth largest poultry dynasty in America. Their name is stamped on billions of chickens sold across the country. Their power was built by Arthur W. Perdue, who turned a $5 investment in a backyard egg farm in 1920 into a massive agribusiness empire. For 3 generations, the Perdues mastered the industrialization of food, growing from a small Maryland farm into a corporation with $8 billion in annual revenue. They produce over 60 million chickens every week. Their influence comes from Perdue Farms, the Perdue Foundation, and most critically, the ironclad contracts they hold over 3,500 American farmers. But that staggering success and the cheap chicken it provides was built on a brutal foundation. The family's history is not just about efficiency. It is a story of relentless, quiet control, marked by decades of allegations over animal cruelty, union busting, and the exploitation of both farmers and immigrant labor. The origins of Arthur Perdue and the rise of Frank. In 1915, Arthur W. Perdue, a respectable railway express agent on the isolated Delmarva Peninsula, made a decision his family likely viewed as madness. He quit his salaried, pensionable job to build a future in dirt and chickens. Arthur W. Perdue, born in 1885, was the product of a specific severe culture. His ancestors were French Huguenots who had fled religious persecution in the 1600s, settling in the flat, wooded marshlands of Maryland's eastern shore. His immediate family, Levin and Martha Perdue, were strict Methodists. They raised their children on a diet of hard work, financial frugality, and a deep, abiding suspicion of debt. This culture of quiet power and relentless thrift was not a business strategy. It was a moral code. It was the only way of life they knew. In the early 1900s, Arthur Perdue had made it by the standards of Wicomico County. He had secured his prized position as a railway express agent in the town of Salisbury. This was a job of immense local importance. In an era before national highways and mass trucking, the railroad was the artery of commerce. Arthur Perdue was the man who connected the isolated farmers of Delmarva to the great hungry markets of the North, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and New York City. From his position at the depot, he saw the local economy in motion every single day. He saw farmers haul in their vegetables, their corn, and their seafood, and he saw them struggle. He saw the weather, the market fluctuations, and the middlemen cut their profits to the bone. But he also noticed something else. He saw a small emerging class of farmers who seemed, even in hard times, to be consistently prosperous. These were the egg farmers. While a vegetable farmer's crop could rot on the vine, eggs were a consistent, daily, high-value protein. The markets in the cities filled with new immigrant populations were desperate for them. Perdue watched these egg farmers ship crate after crate, and he saw their steady, reliable income. He was, by all accounts, a quiet, methodical man. He was not a gambler, but he was a calculator, and he calculated that his future was not on the railroad, but in those chicken coops. In 1915, he acted on his decision. He left his salaried job. In 1917, he married Pearl Parsons, a woman born and raised in the same local culture. She, too, understood the rhythms of the farm. Together, they began to build. In 1920, the same year their only child, Frank Perdue, was born, Arthur W. Perdue made his first official investment. He took $5, a significant sum for a man of his frugal means, and purchased 50 laying hens. The Perdue farm was, at this stage, nothing more than a backyard operation. Arthur Perdue built the coops himself, using the cheap, plentiful pine that covered the peninsula. Pearl Perdue, with a newborn son, tended the flock. Arthur, still working the railroad to pay the bills, would handle the breeding and the finances. Their life was a grueling 7-day-a-week cycle of feeding, cleaning, candling eggs, and digging cesspools by hand. The first 5 years were a lesson in the brutal realities of agriculture. The egg business was not the gold mine Arthur had anticipated. It was competitive, labor-intensive, and subject to its own price fluctuations. He had built his business on a single premise: quality. He had read every agricultural bulletin he could find. He imported a special breeding stock of white leghorn chickens from Texas, a strain known for its prolific egg-laying. He gained a local reputation for quality, but he was not getting rich. He was a small operator in a crowded market. Then, in 1923, just a few miles away in the town of Ocean View, Delaware, a farmer's wife named Cecile Steele changed the world. And in doing so, she saved the Perdue family. Cecile Steele had ordered 50 baby chicks, intending to raise them as egg layers. The hatchery, by mistake, sent her 500. Instead of sending the massive shipment back, she made a historic gamble. She decided to raise all 500 not for their eggs, but for their meat. She housed them in a large shed, fed them a custom mash, and, after a few months, sold the broilers at a staggering profit. The broiler industry, the mass production of chickens exclusively for meat, was born on the Delmarva Peninsula. Word spread like fire. The Delmarva soil was too sandy for most cash crops, but it was perfect for raising chickens. The pine forest provided cheap lumber for the massive broiler houses that began to spring up. The existing network of hatcheries and feed suppliers, which Arthur Perdue was a part of, was already in place. And most importantly, as Arthur knew from his railroad days, the peninsula was a 2-day truck ride from New York City, the largest meat market in the world. Arthur Perdue watched this revolution with the same methodical calculation he had used at the train depot. He saw that the egg market was saturated, but this new explosive broiler industry needed one thing to survive: a constant, reliable supply of baby chicks. In 1925, Arthur Perdue made his first great business pivot. He abandoned the table egg business. He sold off his layers and transformed his entire operation into a hatchery. He would use his passion for quality and his superior leghorn breeding stock to sell chicks to the new broiler farmers. This decision was a masterstroke. He was no longer a simple farmer, subject to the whims of the seasons. He was a supplier, a vital cog in a new industrial machine. His reputation for quality, which had been a mere marketing point in the egg business, now became his greatest asset. Farmers believed Perdue chicks were stronger, healthier, and had a lower mortality rate. This new model, selling high-quality broiler chicks, was the business that carried the Perdue family into the greatest economic crisis in modern history, the Great Depression. When the stock market crashed in 1929, the entire American agricultural system imploded. Prices for cash crops like corn and wheat collapsed to virtually nothing. Farmers across the Midwest, buried in debt from new tractors and over-mortgaged land, were wiped out. They were left to burn their own corn for fuel because it was cheaper than coal. The countryside, as one historian noted, smelled like popcorn. The Delmarva Peninsula was not immune. Broiler prices, which had been as high as 60 cents a pound in the 1920s, crashed to less than 20 cents. Farmers who had taken on debt to build their new broiler houses were ruined, but the Perdue operation survived. It survived for one simple reason: Arthur Perdue hated debt. His son Frank would later describe him as a checkbook balance man. Arthur Perdue, haunted by his Methodist upbringing, refused to borrow money for expansion. Ever. If he had money in the bank, he was secure, even if the business was losing. If he owed money to a bank, He was in a state of mortal sin, even if the business was making $1 million a week. This philosophy, which had kept his company tiny during the boom years of the 1920s, made it indestructible during the bust. While his competitors, who had taken out massive loans to expand their hatcheries, were being foreclosed on, Arthur Perdue's small, debt-free operation chugged along. His reputation for quality chicks became even more critical. In an era of rampant poultry diseases, like the dreaded range paralysis, farmers could not afford to lose their flocks. They were willing to pay a slight premium for Perdue chicks, which they believed were more likely to survive to market weight. It was in this crucible of economic depression that the second-generation leader Frank Perdue was forged. Frank, born in 1920, was 10 years old when the Depression was at its worst. His childhood was not one of privilege. It was one of relentless, 7-day-a-week farm labor. From the moment he could walk, he was cleaning coops, candling eggs, and digging cesspools alongside his father. But Frank was not just a laborer. He was a student of his father's new business. His father, in an act of profound practical education, gave his 10-year-old son a flock of his own. These were the culls, the reject hens, the ones deemed not good enough for the breeding stock. His father told him that any money he could make from these rejects he could keep. This was Frank's first business. He tended his small flock of culls with the same obsessive care his father tended the main flock. He fed them, cared for them, and sold their eggs, and he made money. In the depths of the Great Depression, Frank Perdue was earning $10 to $20 a month in personal pocket money. It was an astonishing sum at a time when grown men were standing in bread lines. This experience taught Frank Perdue a lesson that would one day make him a billionaire. It was a different lesson from the one his father had learned. His father had learned quality and caution. Frank learned efficiency and value extraction. He learned that even waste could be turned into profit if managed with relentless, obsessive focus. Frank Perdue was a brilliant, if average student. He loved baseball, but his future was preordained. In 1937, he enrolled at Salisbury State College, but his heart wasn't in it. He was a chicken man. After 2 years, in 1939, he dropped out to rejoin the family business full-time. The company Frank rejoined was still small, but it was healthy. And Frank, now an adult, brought a new, restless energy. He had learned his father's lesson of quality, but he was not satisfied. He looked at their business model, selling chicks to farmers, and saw the same flaw his father had seen in the egg market. They were still just suppliers. The real money, Frank argued, was being made by the people buying the grown chickens from the farmers. This was the territory of the great meat-packing giants, companies like Armour and Swift. These processors would buy mature broilers from the farmers, slaughter them, and ship them to the cities. They controlled the final price. Frank pushed his cautious father to pivot again. They would not just sell chicks. They would use their own superior chicks to raise their own broilers, and then sell those full-grown birds directly to the processors. This was the company's second major pivot, moving them from a hatchery to a grower. In 1944, the company's name officially changed, a symbolic reflection of this new partnership. It was no longer just A.W. Perdue. It was now A.W. Perdue and Son. The new model was a success. Their reputation for quality followed them. The processors in the cities who were supplying the massive protein-hungry war effort of World War II came to prefer Perdue-grown broilers. The company was growing, but Frank was still not satisfied. He looked at the checks coming in from Swift and Armour and felt the old frustration. They were still middlemen. They were still at the mercy of the processors, who could and did squeeze them on price. Frank began to dream of the final step. Why were they selling their superior chickens to another company only to let that company put its name on the final product? Frank believed that the name Perdue was a mark of quality. He believed that the customer in New York City should be able to ask for a Perdue chicken. This was a revolutionary idea. In the 1940s and 1950s, chicken was a commodity. It was sold generically, plucked, and displayed in a butcher's case. There was no such thing as a brand of chicken. Frank's vision was to control the entire process. He wanted to breed the chick, hatch the egg, grow the chicken, slaughter it, package it, and put his own name on it. This was vertical integration, a model that would give the family total control over quality and, more importantly, total control over the price. Arthur, the checkbook balance man, was terrified. This would require millions of dollars in debt. It would mean building slaughterhouses. It would mean buying fleets of trucks. It would mean going to war with the giant meat packers who were currently their biggest customers. This tension between Arthur's caution and Frank's ambition defined the company for the next decade. Frank Perdue officially became president of A.W. Perdue and Son in 1950. But his father, Arthur, remained the chairman, the quiet power, the man who held the company's checkbook and its soul. Arthur Perdue would not retire. He continued to work 7 days a week well into his 90s, acting as the permanent brake on his son's relentless ambition. But Frank's vision was the future. The small $5 backyard egg farm was gone. The foundation had been laid for an industrial empire. The family's core values, quiet power, total control, and a deep suspicion of any outside influence, especially unions, had been baked into the corporate DNA. The stage was set for the man in the funny-looking suit to take his father's small, respectable company and turn it into a national powerhouse and a national controversy. A tender chicken promise or a brutal racket. The rise of the Perdue Empire, from a respected regional farm into a national protein conglomerate, is the story of one man, Frank Perdue. He was the second generation, the son who inherited the caution and quality obsession of his father, Arthur, and fused it with a relentless, almost brutal ambition that his father had never possessed. The tension between these two men defined the company for decades. Arthur, the checkbook balance man, was terrified of debt. Frank was terrified of being a small-time supplier. He didn't want to just sell to the meat packers. He wanted to become the meat packer. This ideological war came to a head in the 1950s. Frank had officially taken over as president of A.W. Perdue and Son in 1950. But Arthur, then 65, refused to retire. He remained chairman of the board and held the company's finances in a vice. Frank, chafing under this control, saw the future. He saw that the real money was not in growing chickens, but in processing them. The great meat packers like Swift and Armour, who were the Perdue's biggest customers, were the ones making the real profit. They would buy Perdue's high-quality live birds, slaughter them, and then sell them under the generic Swift or Armour brand. Frank, who believed his chickens were genetically superior, saw this as theft. His quality was being stolen and rebranded by a middleman. He proposed a radical, terrifying idea: vertical integration. He wanted Perdue to build its own processing plant, its own slaughterhouse. This would be the final, ultimate pivot. Perdue would control everything: the breeding, the hatching, the growing, the processing, and the marketing. It was a vision of total control. To Arthur Perdue, this was madness. It was not just a new business. It was a declaration of war on their own customers. And worse, it would require debt, millions of dollars in debt. It violated every principle Arthur had used to survive the Great Depression. The two men fought bitterly over the decision for years. Frank, in his typical style, was relentless. He pushed and pushed, arguing that caution in this new post-war economy was just a slower form of bankruptcy. Frank finally won. He secured the financing, a move that his father likely viewed as a moral failure. He built the first Perdue processing plant in his hometown of Salisbury, Maryland. This single debt-fueled decision was the true birth of the modern Perdue farms. It was the moment the company passed from Arthur's generation of caution to Frank's generation of conquest. But it created an immediate, massive problem. Owning a processing plant is like owning a blast furnace. It is a monster that must be fed. A slaughter line, to be profitable, cannot be run at half speed. It demands a constant, predictable, and massive supply of full-grown chickens, delivered to its door every single day. The Perdue family farm, even as large as it had become, could not possibly supply this monster. This is where Frank Perdue's true genius and the central controversy of his legacy was born. He needed a cheap, flexible, and massive army of growers, and he found one in the struggling independent farmers of the Delmarva Peninsula. This was the birth of the contract farming model. It was a brilliantly simple and brutally effective system. Perdue would not buy the farms. That would mean taking on land, labor, and debt. Instead, Frank Perdue approached the farmers of Maryland and Delaware with a proposition. He told them, "You, the farmer, will take out the loan to build the massive modern chicken houses. You will provide the land, the labor, the water, and the electricity. You will assume 100% of the financial risk. I, Perdue, will provide you with two things: the baby chicks, which I own, and the feed, which I also own. At the end of 8 weeks, I will return, collect my chickens, and pay you for your service, if the chickens meet my standards." This system was an economic masterpiece for Perdue. It offloaded all the capital risk onto the backs of the farmers, transforming them from independent businessmen into indentured sharecroppers. The farmer was no longer a farmer. He was a grower, a contractor, a low-wage manager on his own land. And to ensure total control, Frank Perdue implemented the tournament system. This was the psychological core of the contract. Perdue did not pay its farmers a flat rate. Instead, it pitted them against each other in a secret zero-sum game. All the farmers who had received chicks in the same week were ranked. Their performance was measured by a complex, opaque formula controlled by Perdue: feed conversion, weight gain, mortality rate. At the end of the cycle, the farmers at the top of the ranking, the winners, would receive a small bonus. The farmers in the middle would get the standard base pay, and the farmers at the bottom, the losers, would have their pay cut. If a farmer landed at the bottom of the tournament too many times, Perdue would simply terminate their contract. This system was devastatingly effective. It created a culture of intense fear and silence. A farmer who complained about the quality of the chicks he received or the price of the feed Perdue sold him knew he could be punished. The Perdue flock supervisor, the company man who visited the farms, held the power of life and death. He could grade a farmer's performance down, pushing him to the bottom of the tournament. The farmers, trapped by million-dollar bank loans for chicken houses that had no other purpose, had no choice but to remain silent and do exactly as they were told. With this ironclad system of supply in place, Frank Perdue's processing plant roared to life. He had solved the supply problem. Now he had to solve the demand problem. In the 1960s, chicken was still a commodity. It was sold generically in butcher shops and supermarkets. A chicken from Perdue looked identical to a chicken from Tyson or any other competitor. Frank knew his chickens were different. His father's obsessive breeding and his own unique feed formulas had, he believed, created a superior bird. The problem was the customer had no way of knowing this. His first innovation was a marketing gimmick that became a company trademark: the yellow chicken. Frank knew that housewives in the New York markets associated a healthy, corn-fed bird with a rich, yellowish skin. Most chickens, raised on standard grain, were pale and white. So Frank engineered his feed. He began adding massive quantities of marigold petals and alfalfa to his chicken feed, a move that dyed the skin of the birds a deep, golden yellow. It did nothing for the taste, it did nothing for the nutrition, but in the supermarket, under the fluorescent lights, the Perdue chicken glowed. It looked healthier, it looked more expensive. This was the first step. The second came in 1968. Frank decided to do what no other chicken processor had dared. He put his own name on the package. He created the Perdue brand. From now on, his chickens would be sold in their own branded bags with a tag on the wing. He was making a personal promise of quality. This created the third and most important problem: how to tell the world. In 1971, Frank Perdue hired the hotshot New York advertising agency Scully McCabe Slovis. The ad men were tasked with a simple goal: sell this yellow chicken brand. The agency executives, according to industry legend, came to a startling conclusion. The product itself was good, but the real brand, the most compelling asset the company had, was Frank Perdue himself. Frank was, by all accounts, the opposite of a polished corporate spokesman. He was balding, gangly, and had a high, nasal, abrasive voice. He looked, as one of his own ad men reportedly said, like a chicken. He was awkward, intense, and deeply, transparently obsessive. And the agency saw gold. They realized that in an age of faceless, untrustworthy corporations, putting this funny-looking man on television to personally guarantee his product would be an act of disruptive genius. Frank Perdue hated the idea. He was part of a family that valued quiet power and invisibility. But he was, above all, a businessman. He reluctantly agreed. The resulting television campaign changed the history of food marketing. Frank Perdue, looking uncomfortable in his suit, stood in front of the camera and in his reedy voice made his case. The commercials were unscripted and confrontational. He would hold up a competitor's chicken and point out its flaws. This chicken has a broken wing, ours don't. He would tear a package open. This chicken has too much fat, mine don't. And then he delivered the slogan that would become an American icon: "It takes a tough man to make a tender chicken." This line was a masterpiece of psychological branding. It perfectly captured Frank's entire persona. It implied that he was a relentless, obsessive perfectionist. It suggested that his toughness was a shield, protecting the customer from the low-quality generic birds sold by his competitors. It was a personal promise from one tough man to the American family. The campaign was an immediate, explosive success. The company, which had been a regional supplier, went national. Frank Perdue became one of the most recognizable businessmen in America, a folk hero. The company's growth was exponential. The 1 million birds a year operation Frank had inherited in 1950 exploded into a 200 million birds a year empire by the 1970s. Frank poured money back into the advertising that had made him famous, spending over $50 million on the campaign in the 1980s alone. But the tough man slogan had a dark double meaning. The same toughness that consumers loved was the same toughness his farmers, and increasingly his factory workers, had come to fear. To feed the new national demand, Frank Perdue had to expand, and he made a critical strategic decision. He would expand south. He pushed out of the Delmarva Peninsula and built massive new processing complexes in states like North Carolina and Georgia. This decision was not based on weather. It was based on law. These were right-to-work states. Right to work is a legal framework that is the cornerstone of anti-union strategy. It makes it illegal for a company and a union to require that all workers pay union dues. This, in effect, starves unions of their funding, crippling their ability to organize, to bargain collectively, and to strike. For Frank Perdue, a man who had inherited his father's deep suspicion of any outside influence, these states were a paradise. This southern expansion allowed Perdue to tap into a new, cheaper labor force. As the 1980s and 1990s progressed, this workforce became increasingly composed of immigrant labor, particularly from Mexico and Haiti. These workers were often undocumented, spoke little English, and were terrified of being deported. They were the perfect workforce for a tough boss. They were cheap, they were replaceable, and they were too frightened to complain about low wages or dangerous conditions. This new labor strategy allowed Perdue to keep its wages 15 to 20% lower than its unionized competitors in the North, giving it a massive advantage in the cheap chicken wars. This was Frank's empire, a marketing-fueled demand from the cities, supplied by a debt-ridden army of contract farmers, and processed by a low-wage, non-unionized immigrant workforce in the South. In 1991, Frank Perdue stepped down, passing the company to his son, Jim Perdue. Jim was the third generation, and he was nothing like his father or grandfather. Arthur was the frugal farmer. Frank was the tough industrialist. Jim was a suburban academic. He had a PhD in marine biology. He was quiet, polished, and looked, as one reporter noted, more like a college professor than a chicken baron. Jim Perdue inherited a company that was facing a new crisis. The tough man era was ending. The market was changing. Consumers in the 1990s and 2000s were no longer just focused on price and a yellow skin. They were beginning to ask the very questions Frank's marketing had been designed to obscure. What is in that feed? Why is this chicken so cheap? A new wave of public awareness about industrial farming, animal welfare, and, most critically, antibiotics was beginning to build. Scientists and public health officials were sounding the alarm. The routine, sub-therapeutic use of antibiotics in chicken feed, a practice Perdue and all its competitors used to promote faster growth and prevent disease in their overcrowded barns, was creating antibiotic-resistant superbugs that threatened human health. Jim Perdue, the quiet scientist, saw this crisis coming long before his competitors. He knew the tough man slogan was obsolete. The new consumer wanted a safe man, a clean man. He made a gamble that was just as massive as his father's first processing plant. He decided to pivot the entire Perdue supply chain toward eliminating antibiotics. It was a staggering undertaking. It meant re-engineering the entire vertical integration model. Without the crutch of antibiotics, Perdue had to find new ways to keep its chickens alive. It meant redesigning the barns, changing the feed again, and investing millions in new ventilation and hygiene protocols. It was slow, expensive, and wildly risky. In 2014, Perdue Farms became the first major poultry company to announce that the vast majority of its products were no antibiotics ever. It was a marketing masterstroke. Jim Perdue had successfully navigated the greatest market shift in his industry's history. He had repositioned the Perdue brand for the 21st century, flanking his competitors, Tyson and Pilgrim's Pride, and capturing the massive high-margin, organic and all-natural market. The company's revenue soared, solidifying its place as an $8 billion a year giant. But behind this clean, naive facade, the old, tough machinery was still running. While Jim Perdue was promoting his clean chicken, his company was, according to the Department of Justice, colluding with the very competitors he was supposedly fighting. In the 2010s, a series of massive antitrust lawsuits were filed against the entire poultry industry, naming Perdue, Tyson, Pilgrim's Pride, and others. The allegations were damning. These companies, which presented themselves as fierce rivals, were allegedly operating as a classic oligopoly, a big chicken cartel. The lawsuits accused them of conspiring for years to fix, raise, and stabilize the price of broiler chickens. They were also accused of illegally sharing detailed wage and compensation data with each other, a tactic designed to keep factory worker wages artificially low across the entire industry. Perdue's quiet power manifested in other ways. While they competed with giants like Cargill, they also allied with them. In the 2000s, Perdue and Cargill formed a joint venture, a supply chain alliance, to purchase supplies together, a move that gave them even more power to squeeze smaller vendors. By the modern era, the company that Arthur Perdue had started with $5 was unrecognizable. Jim Perdue, the PhD, had perfected the model. He had combined his father's tough contract system and his grandfather's quality obsession with a modern, scientific, clean marketing message. But the foundation of the empire remained unchanged. It was still a business built on a model of total control, a model that, as critics would soon reveal, treated its animals, its workers, and its farmers as little more than interchangeable cogs in a massive, relentless, and brutal machine. The humane lie exposed, the marketing genius of Frank Perdue, and the subsequent clean chicken rebranding by his son Jim created a powerful multi-billion-dollar consumer brand. The Perdue name, stamped in bright red on packages in supermarkets across America, was built on a promise: quality, wholesomeness, and, increasingly, a vague notion of responsible farming. Frank's famous slogan, "It takes a tough man to make a tender chicken," implied a personal guarantee, a level of obsessive care that set his birds apart. Jim Perdue's later pivot to no antibiotics ever reinforced this image, suggesting a company that was not just efficient, but ethical. This carefully constructed brand image, however, created a massive vulnerability. Perdue had invited the public to trust its name, to believe in the wholesomeness behind the yellow skin and the NAE label. This made the company a prime target for a new generation of activists who believed that the entire system of industrial animal agriculture was built on a foundation of hidden suffering. The battle over Perdue's animal welfare practices would become one of the most visible, brutal, and consequential fights in the modern food movement. It pitted a dynasty built on quiet power against activists armed with hidden cameras, exposing the bloody gears of the machine that produced America's cheap chicken. The conflict did not begin with the internet age. The first shots were fired decades earlier, during Frank Perdue's reign. In the 1980s and 1990s, organizations like People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals began to challenge the very premise of industrial poultry farming. Frank Perdue, as the public face of the industry, became their primary target. PETA activists staged protests outside his processing plants, marched alongside striking Perdue workers, and worked to pierce the veil of secrecy surrounding the massive, windowless chicken houses that dotted the Delmarva landscape. PETA's early campaigns were aggressive and confrontational. They detailed the grim realities that were becoming standard industry practices Frank Perdue had helped pioneer. They described the extreme overcrowding, tens of thousands of birds packed into sheds so tightly that each bird lived its entire 6-week life in a space roughly the size of a standard sheet of paper. They documented the ammonia fumes rising from the accumulated waste on the floor, fumes so strong they burned the bird's eyes and lungs. They highlighted the genetic manipulation that was creating birds designed to grow unnaturally fast, leading to widespread leg deformities and heart failure. Young birds literally bred to outgrow their own skeletons and organs. PETA activists conducted their own rudimentary investigations. At Perdue's main slaughterhouse in Salisbury, Maryland, PETA's co-founder Ingrid Newkirk documented chickens left to die from heat stroke in transport crates outside the facility. She discovered other injured or dying birds being thrown still alive into 4D bins, containers for dead, dying, diseased, and disabled animals deemed unfit for human consumption. In one infamous incident in 1992, an activist dressed in a chicken costume threw a pie at Frank Perdue during a public appearance, a stunt designed to humiliate the tough man and draw attention to his company's practices. During this era, PETA also made explosive, though ultimately unproven, allegations connecting Frank Perdue to organized crime. Citing internal documents and whistleblower accounts from the 1980s, PETA claimed that Perdue had connections to New York mob figures, allegedly using them to intimidate union organizers and potentially silence critics who expose conditions inside his plants. While these specific mafia ties were never substantiated in court, they added to the growing perception of Perdue Farms as a company that operated with a ruthless, secretive, and potentially criminal disregard for both animal and human welfare. Frank Perdue largely dismissed these early protests as the ravings of fringe radicals. His brand was strong, the science of animal welfare was still nascent, and the public was largely unaware of, or unconcerned with, the realities behind their cheap chicken dinners. But the seeds of doubt had been sown. The landscape shifted dramatically in the 2000s and 2010s. The rise of the internet, the ubiquity of camera phones, and a growing consumer interest in food sourcing created a perfect storm. Undercover investigations, once the domain of dedicated activists, became easier to conduct and, crucially, easier to disseminate. Graphic videos posted online could bypass traditional media gatekeepers and reach millions of consumers directly, often going viral within hours. This new era of digital activism put the entire meat industry on the defensive, and Perdue, with its high-profile brand built on trust, was squarely in the crosshairs. The first major blow in this new war came not from an animal rights group, but from the mainstream financial press. In 2014, Forbes magazine published a damning expose titled "Foul Play." The investigation focused on conditions at Petaluma Poultry, a California-based company that Perdue had acquired. Petaluma was not just any supplier. It was the producer of Perdue's premium Rocky the Range chicken brand, marketed as organic, free-range, and humanely raised. Forbes reporters working with whistleblowers inside the company documented horrific conditions that directly contradicted this idyllic image. The report described birds packed into filthy, overcrowded sheds, suffering from rampant disease and untreated injuries. It detailed instances where feed and water lines had malfunctioned, leading to mass starvation and dehydration. It painted a picture of systemic neglect, driven by intense pressure to cut costs and maximize production, even under the supposedly higher standards of an organic, humanely raised label. The Foul Play article was significant because it wasn't just about animal cruelty. It was about consumer fraud. It suggested that Perdue's premium labels, for which consumers paid a significant price premium, were potentially meaningless, a marketing facade hiding the same industrial realities. The Forbes report created a firestorm, but it was nothing compared to what came next. In December 2015, the animal rights organization Mercy for Animals released perhaps the single most damaging undercover video in Perdue's history. An MFA investigator had secured a job at a Perdue contract farm in North Carolina, one of the thousands of supposedly independent farms raising chickens under Perdue's strict control. Over several weeks, the investigators secretly filmed the daily operations inside the massive broiler houses. The resulting video was brutal and undeniable. It showed workers engaging in sadistic acts of cruelty. Chickens were shown being kicked like footballs, thrown against walls, and stomped on with violent force. Birds with gruesome open wounds or mangled legs were shown being left to suffer and die slowly amidst the flock, without any veterinary care. The footage captured workers carelessly grabbing birds by their legs or wings and slamming them into transport crates. In one particularly disturbing sequence, a worker was shown violently swinging a sick bird around by its head in a crude attempt to break its neck, leaving the animal convulsing on the floor. The MFA video was expertly produced and disseminated. It went viral almost instantly, racking up millions of views on social media and generating headlines across national news outlets. The graphic images were inescapable. This was not just neglect. It was active, malicious abuse happening under the Perdue system. The legal fallout was immediate. The workers caught on camera were fired. One supervisor was arrested and charged with multiple counts of felony animal cruelty under North Carolina law. Perdue was fined $10,000 for the violations. But the damage to the brand was far greater. The MFA video struck at the very heart of the Perdue promise. This abuse was not happening at some rogue, distant supplier. It was happening on a farm raising chickens directly for Perdue, under the supervision of Perdue's own flock advisors. It exposed the lie behind the carefully crafted image. Simultaneously, another legal and ethical assault was launched, this one targeting Perdue's marketing itself. In 2010, and again with renewed force after the MFA video, the Animal Welfare Institute filed formal complaints challenging Perdue's use of the labels humanely raised and raised cage-free on its packaging. AWI's argument was devastatingly simple. The term humanely raised, AWI asserted, was fundamentally misleading. Perdue was using standards developed by the National Chicken Council, the industry's own trade group. These standards, AWI pointed out, allowed for practices that the average consumer would find anything but humane. Under NCC guidelines, birds could be confined for their entire lives in windowless sheds with less than 1 square foot of space per bird. They required no access to fresh air, sunlight, or any environmental enrichment. These were, in essence, the standard abysmal conditions of factory farming, rebranded as humane. AWI cited national polls showing that the vast majority of consumers believed humanely raised meant significantly higher standards, including access to the outdoors. The raised cage-free label was even more deceptive. AWI argued, broiler chickens raised for meat are never raised in cages, industry-wide. Cages are used for egg-laying hens, not meat birds. Perdue's use of the raised cage-free label, AWI contended, served no purpose other than to cynically capitalize on consumer confusion, making shoppers think they were getting a special benefit when they were simply getting the industry standard. It was, AWI President Kathy Liss stated, an attempt to exploit the average consumer's unfamiliarity with modern animal husbandry. This two-pronged assault, the MFA video exposing brutal abuse and the AWI complaint exposing deceptive marketing, created an existential crisis for the Perdue brand. The Humane Society of the United States piled on, filing class action lawsuits in New Jersey and Florida on behalf of consumers who had purchased Perdue's Harvestland brand chicken, alleging they had been defrauded by the humanely raised label. Perdue, under the leadership of Jim Perdue, initially reacted defensively. The company condemned the abuse shown in the MFA video, fired the workers involved, and stated that the incident was an aberration, not representative of their standards. They initially fought the AWI complaint and the HSUS lawsuits, insisting their labels were accurate according to the NCC guidelines and were approved by the USDA. But the public relations damage was too severe. Sales reportedly dropped by 5% in the immediate aftermath of the MFA video. The carefully cultivated image of trust was shattering. Jim Perdue, the scientist, realized that denial was not a sustainable strategy. He needed to change the narrative. What followed was a massive, expensive, and sophisticated public relations counter-offensive, a strategy reminiscent of the one Ivy Lee had deployed for John D. Rockefeller Jr. after the Ludlow massacre. Perdue did not just issue press releases. They attempted to co-opt the language and the concerns of their critics. In 2016, Jim Perdue announced the Perdue Commitments to Animal Care. This was a highly publicized four-part plan designed to position Perdue not just as compliant, but as a leader in animal welfare. The plan was based on the internationally recognized 5 freedoms of animal welfare. The commitments included specific, measurable goals. Perdue pledged to retrofit hundreds of existing chicken houses with windows to provide natural light. They promised to test enrichments like perches and bales of hay to encourage more natural behaviors. They committed to studying the effects of slower-growing chicken breeds, implicitly acknowledging the welfare problems caused by the rapid growth genetics. Crucially, they promised to improve their relationship with their contract farmers, creating more open dialogue and potentially changing the punitive tournament system. The most radical part of the plan was the commitment to openness, transparency, and trust. Perdue announced it would actively engage with animal welfare groups, including its harshest critics. It established an animal care council comprised of outside experts and advocates. And in a move that stunned the industry, Perdue began offering public tours of its chicken farms and even its slaughterhouse. This was the opposite of the industry's traditional secrecy. It was a bold gamble: show the public everything and hope that transparency would rebuild trust. Perdue even made overtures to the group that had wounded them most deeply. In a remarkable turn, Perdue executives initiated conversations with Mercy for Animals. As Mark McKay, a Perdue president, and Leah Garces, the president of MFA, would later co-write in a Food Dive article, the initial contact was tense. But Perdue thanked MFA for exposing the abuse, admitted it violated their standards, and invited them into a dialogue about improving conditions. This unprecedented collaboration between a corporate giant and an activist group seemed to signal a genuine shift. But the truce was fragile, and many activists remained deeply skeptical. Groups like Direct Action Everywhere, known for more confrontational tactics, viewed Perdue's transparency initiative as a sophisticated PR stunt. They saw the open farms as carefully curated Potemkin villages designed to distract from the ongoing suffering in the thousands of other facilities that remained hidden. DXE continued its own investigations and protests. Their activists began staging disruptive in-store protests at supermarkets selling Perdue products, chanting slogans, holding graphic signs, and sometimes splattering fake blood in the meat aisles. They also continued the high-risk practice of open rescue, entering Perdue facilities at night to document conditions and remove sick or injured birds, actions they claimed were justified under animal cruelty laws and the legal doctrine of necessity. This led to inevitable clashes and legal battles. Perdue, like much of the agricultural industry, supported ag-gag laws designed to criminalize undercover filming on farms. They pursued trespass and theft charges against DXE activists. In a high-profile case stemming from rescues at Perdue's Petaluma poultry subsidiary in California, DXE investigator Zoe Rosenberg faced multiple felony charges. While she was ultimately acquitted of the most serious charges in a high-profile 2024 trial, the case highlighted the intense legal battles over documenting farm conditions. DXE argued Rosenberg was a whistleblower exposing criminal cruelty. Perdue and the Sonoma County District Attorney argued she was a criminal who had violated biosecurity protocols and stolen property. The legal fight highlighted the unresolved tension. Was documenting suffering a protected act of whistleblowing or a dangerous criminal trespass? Beyond the dramatic videos and protests, a deeper, more insidious form of suffering remained inherent in Perdue's business model. The very genetics of the modern broiler chicken, breeds Perdue had helped pioneer, were a source of constant systemic welfare problems. These birds were engineered to grow from chick to slaughter weight in just 6 weeks, a rate 4 times faster than chickens in the 1950s. This rapid growth, while economically efficient, came at a terrible physiological cost. Veterinarians and poultry scientists documented widespread health issues directly linked to this accelerated growth. Birds frequently suffered from leg deformities, their immature skeletons unable to support their rapidly expanding muscle mass. Many became crippled, unable to walk to reach food or water. Heart attacks and ascites were common causes of death, even in young birds. In recent years, new muscle myopathies emerged, conditions directly linked to the industry's obsession with maximizing breast meat yield. Woody breast syndrome caused the breast muscle to become abnormally hard and fibrous. White striping created visible white lines of fat and collagen within the muscle. Spaghetti meat resulted in muscle tissue that was soft and tore apart easily. While these conditions primarily affected meat quality, leading to economic losses for Perdue, they were also indicators of profound metabolic stress and muscle damage in the living birds. This was not abuse inflicted by rogue workers. This was suffering engineered into the bird's very DNA by the demands of the market. The fight over Perdue's animal welfare record continues. While the company has undeniably made significant changes to its policies and marketing since the crises of 2014 to 2015, major animal welfare organizations remain critical. Reports from groups like the Humane Society of the United States still rank Perdue below smaller, more progressive companies on animal welfare metrics. The activists argue that while windows in barns and a few enrichments are welcome, they do not fundamentally alter the realities of industrial confinement, rapid growth genetics, or the brutality of the slaughter process. The 5% sales drop Perdue experienced after the MFA video demonstrated that consumers do care about animal welfare, at least when confronted with graphic evidence. Jim Perdue's subsequent reforms were a tacit admission that the tough man era was over, and that brand trust in the 21st century required at least the appearance of ethical treatment. But the core conflict remains unresolved. The relentless market demand for cheap chicken, a demand Perdue itself helped create, continues to exert immense pressure on the system. Whether genuine welfare improvements can coexist with the brutal efficiencies of industrial poultry production remains the central unanswered question in the Perdue saga. Amputations, fear, and child labor in the slaughterhouse. The brutal efficiency of the Perdue poultry machine, which transformed living birds into shrink-wrapped packages with blinding speed, exacted a heavy toll not just on the animals, but on the human beings who operated the lines. While Frank Perdue's folksy television persona promised tenderness, and Jim Perdue's marketing touted wholesomeness, the reality inside the company's vast processing plants was, according to numerous investigations, lawsuits, and worker testimonies, a story of relentless pressure, crippling injuries, low wages, and the systemic exploitation of a vulnerable immigrant workforce. The same toughness Frank Perdue celebrated was allegedly turned inward, creating a work environment where human bodies were treated as disposable cogs in the relentless pursuit of cheap chicken. The heart of the Perdue processing operation is the disassembly line. It's a system perfected over decades, designed to move tens of thousands of chicken carcasses through a series of cutting, deboning, and packaging stations at maximum velocity. Workers stand shoulder to shoulder in cold, damp, and deafeningly loud environments, often for shifts lasting 10 to 12 hours. Their tasks are hyper-specialized and endlessly repetitive, hanging live birds onto shackles, making precise cuts with razor-sharp knives or scissors, pulling specific muscles from the bone, or packing finished pieces into trays. Each worker might make the exact same motion, a twist of the wrist, a pull with the fingers, a slice with a blade, tens of thousands of times per shift. This extreme repetition, performed at speeds dictated by the ever-accelerating line, is the primary source of the crippling injuries that plague the poultry workforce. Musculoskeletal disorders are rampant. Workers develop agonizing conditions like carpal tunnel syndrome, where the median nerve in the wrist becomes compressed, causing numbness, tingling, and debilitating pain in the hands and arms. Tendinitis, the inflammation of tendons from overuse, is common in shoulders, elbows, and wrists. Back injuries from repetitive lifting or standing in awkward positions for hours on end are endemic. These are not minor aches and pains. They are often career-ending, life-altering injuries. Workers described losing strength in their hands, being unable to grip objects, open jars, or even hold their own children. The pain could become chronic, radiating up their arms and into their necks, making sleep impossible. Yet reporting these injuries was, according to numerous accounts, actively discouraged. The workforce inside Perdue's plants, particularly in the southern expansion facilities built from the 1980s onward, became overwhelmingly composed of immigrant labor. Estimates suggest that by the 2000s and 2010s, as much as 80% of the line workers were immigrants, primarily from Mexico, Guatemala, and Haiti. Many were undocumented or held precarious visa statuses. They often spoke little or no English. This demographic reality created a perfect storm for exploitation. These workers were often deeply dependent on Perdue for their livelihood. They lived in isolated rural communities, frequently housed in company-influenced trailer parks or rental properties. With few other job opportunities available, they were acutely aware that complaining about safety conditions, reporting injuries, or, most dangerously, attempting to organize could result in immediate termination and potential deportation. This created a pervasive climate of fear. Supervisors, under intense pressure to meet production quotas dictated by the relentless speed of the line, allegedly fostered this fear. Workers reported being screamed at, threatened, and disciplined for not keeping up. Bathroom breaks were strictly limited, sometimes denied altogether, leading to workers urinating on themselves on the line to avoid being fired. Requests for medical attention for injuries were allegedly often ignored, downplayed, or met with retaliation. Workers who reported injuries might find themselves assigned to even more difficult tasks, or simply terminated for being unable to perform their duties. The company's official safety protocols were often undermined by the reality on the floor. While Perdue provided safety gear and conducted training, the sheer speed of the line made accidents almost inevitable. knives slipped. Workers became entangled in machinery. Floors, slick with water, fat, and blood, were treacherous. The most horrific injuries involved the processing machinery itself. The lines were a complex web of conveyor belts, high-speed saws, deboning machines, and packaging equipment. Amputations were shockingly common. Reports documented an average of 10 amputations per year across Perdue's facilities. Workers lost fingers, hands, and sometimes entire arms, caught in unguarded machinery or during frantic attempts to clear jams without stopping the line, an action supervisors allegedly discouraged due to the impact on production quotas. A particularly harrowing account emerged from a 2017 New Yorker investigation by EO Press, detailing life inside a Perdue plant in Accomack, Virginia. Workers described the constant threat of injury. One recounted seeing a co-worker's arm pulled into a machine, mangled beyond recognition. Another described the pervasive numbness in her hands from carpal tunnel, a condition so common it was almost considered part of the job. The article highlighted the company's alleged practice of cycling through workers, hiring them, working them until they broke down with injuries, and then replacing them with fresh recruits from the same vulnerable immigrant pool. Wages remained stubbornly low, hovering just above the minimum wage for decades. While Frank Perdue became a multimillionaire and the family amassed billions, the line workers who produced that wealth often lived in poverty. In recent years, typical wages have hovered just above minimum wage, often reported around $12 to $14 an hour. This was often not enough to support a family, forcing workers into crowded, substandard housing and reliance on public assistance programs. The low wages, combined with the dangerous conditions, created a cycle of poverty and injury that trapped many immigrant families for generations. Perdue, like its competitors Tyson and Pilgrim's Pride, faced numerous Occupational Safety and Health Administration investigations and fines over the years for safety violations. These often resulted in citations for inadequate machine guarding, lack of proper training, and failure to address ergonomic hazards. However, critics argued that the fines levied by OSHA were often minuscule compared to the company's profits, representing little more than the cost of doing business. The economic incentive, they claimed, remained squarely focused on maximizing line speed, even at the expense of worker safety. The alleged collusion between Perdue and its competitors, as detailed in the antitrust lawsuits of the 2010s, extended to labor practices. The lawsuits accused the major poultry companies of illegally sharing detailed wage and compensation data with each other through secretive third-party surveys. This practice, plaintiffs argued, allowed the companies to collectively suppress wages across the entire industry, ensuring that workers had no leverage to demand better pay even in a tight labor market. If all the major employers were implicitly agreeing not to raise wages, workers had nowhere else to go. This alleged conspiracy effectively trapped the workforce in a low-wage equilibrium, benefiting the company's bottom lines while keeping their employees in poverty. The most shocking labor scandal, however, involved the exploitation of the most vulnerable population imaginable: children. In July 2024, the U.S. Department of Labor concluded a major investigation into child labor practices within the meatpacking industry, and Perdue Farms was a central target. The investigation found that Perdue, along with several of its cleaning contractors, had systematically employed underage migrant children in some of the most dangerous jobs in its processing plants across multiple states. The DOL investigators uncovered evidence that children, some as young as 13 years old, were working illegal overnight shifts. Their jobs involved cleaning hazardous slaughterhouse equipment, including head splitters, carcass splitters, and rotating picker machines used to remove feathers. They were using caustic chemicals and working around dangerous machinery, tasks strictly forbidden for minors under the Fair Labor Standards Act. These children were part of a larger wave of unaccompanied minors who had crossed the border, often fleeing poverty and violence in Central America. They were desperate for work, spoke little English, and were often deeply indebted to sponsors or traffickers, making them exceptionally vulnerable to exploitation. Contractors, hired by Perdue to handle the overnight cleaning shifts, allegedly recruited these children, sometimes using fraudulent identification documents, and paid them minimal wages for grueling, dangerous work. The investigation, which concluded in July 2024, resulted in significant fines, part of a larger $3.8 million settlement involving multiple companies, and forced Perdue to agree to nationwide reforms and stricter oversight of its contractors. As part of a settlement agreement, Perdue pledged to implement stricter oversight of its contractors, conduct third-party audits, and establish a hotline for workers to report child labor concerns anonymously. The child labor scandal was a devastating blow to Perdue's carefully crafted image of corporate responsibility. It confirmed the critics' darkest allegations that the relentless drive for low costs had created a system where even the most basic labor laws were being violated, and where vulnerable children were being placed in mortal danger to clean the machinery that produced America's cheap chicken. The company's response followed a familiar pattern. Jim Perdue expressed shock and dismay, blamed rogue contractors, and pledged immediate reforms. But for many observers, the scandal was not an aberration. It was the inevitable consequence of an industry built on minimizing labor costs at all costs. The reliance on a low-wage, non-unionized, often undocumented immigrant workforce had created the perfect environment for such abuses to flourish, hidden in the shadows of the midnight cleaning shifts. The human cost of the Perdue processing line was not just measured in amputated fingers or crippling nerve damage. It was measured in the lives of workers trapped in a cycle of poverty, fear, and injury. It was measured in the exploitation of vulnerable immigrants and children. It was the hidden, human subsidy that allowed Perdue chicken to remain so cheap, the price paid by the workers, whose bodies were broken by the relentless speed of the machine Frank Perdue built. The war on unions and farmers, the brutal efficiency of the Perdue processing line, built on speed, and the exploitation of a vulnerable workforce was only one half of the company's low-cost equation. The other half, equally critical and just as ruthlessly enforced, was the systematic suppression of any organized power that might challenge the family's absolute control. This war was fought on two fronts, against the factory workers who dared to unionize, and against the supposedly independent contract farmers who raised the company's chickens. For decades, Perdue perfected a strategy of union busting and farmer control that became a model for the entire agribusiness industry, ensuring that both labor and growers remained isolated, fearful, and utterly dependent on the company's dictates. This was the hidden architecture of quiet power, a system designed to atomize dissent and guarantee the uninterrupted flow of cheap chicken. The roots of Perdue's anti-union stance run deep, back to the company's very origins. Arthur W. Perdue, the frugal founder, brought his conservative Mennonite suspicion of outside influences into the business. Unions in this worldview were not partners, they were interlopers, disruptive forces that threatened the family's direct control over its operations and, crucially, its costs. This philosophy was passed down and intensified by his son, Frank Perdue, Frank's ambition was not just to build a bigger company, but to build it on his own terms. As he began his massive expansion in the 1960s and 1970s, he made a pivotal strategic decision. He would push south. While the company's heart remained in Salisbury, Maryland, Frank targeted states like North Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, and Delaware for his new large-scale processing complexes. This was not a random choice. These were right-to-work states. The term right to work is one of the most Orwellian phrases in American labor law. It sounds like a guarantee of employment, but its actual effect is the opposite. It is designed to destroy the financial viability of labor unions. Right-to-work laws, passed primarily in the historically anti-union South and West, make it illegal for a union and an employer to negotiate a contract, requiring all workers covered by that contract to pay union dues or agency fees. This creates a free rider problem. Workers can receive all the benefits of the union contract, higher wages, better benefits, grievance procedures, without paying a cent towards the cost of negotiating and enforcing that contract. This inevitably weakens the union's finances, reduces its bargaining power, and makes organizing new workplaces incredibly difficult. For companies like Perdue, right-to-work laws were a powerful weapon, a state-sanctioned tool for keeping unions out and wages down. Frank Perdue skillfully exploited this legal landscape. By concentrating his expansion in these states, he could tap into a large pool of low-wage, non-union labor, primarily in rural areas, with few other employment options. This allowed him to keep his labor costs significantly lower, estimated at 15 to 20% lower than competitors operating in unionized states like Pennsylvania or New Jersey. It was a key factor in Perdue's ability to undercut competitors on price and fuel its explosive growth. But right-to-work laws were just the foundation. When unions did attempt to organize Perdue workers, even in non-right-to-work states like Maryland, the company allegedly responded with a sophisticated and aggressive union avoidance strategy. This was not simply passive resistance. It was active warfare. The playbook, documented in numerous worker complaints to the National Labor Relations Board and in journalistic investigations, involved a multi-pronged assault designed to intimidate, divide, and ultimately crush any organizing effort. The first step was often surveillance and infiltration. Supervisors were allegedly trained to identify pro-union workers and monitor their activities. Workers reported being questioned about their union sympathies, having their break times monitored, and seeing unfamiliar managers suddenly appear on the factory floor during organizing drives. In some cases, companies have been known to plant anti-union employees within the workforce to gather information and spread disinformation. The second and most visible tactic was the captive audience meeting. Federal labor law allows employers to hold mandatory meetings during work hours where they can present anti-union arguments. Perdue allegedly utilized these meetings relentlessly during organizing drives. Workers described being forced to sit through hours of presentations filled with dire warnings about the cost of union dues, the risk of strikes, and the supposed corruption of union leaders. These meetings often featured slick videos and presentations designed to portray the union as an outside third party that would destroy the Perdue family atmosphere. Attendance was mandatory. Dissent was not tolerated. The third weapon was the union buster, professional consultants specializing in union avoidance campaigns. Companies like Perdue reportedly spent hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of dollars hiring these firms. These consultants often deployed teams of smooth-talking operatives who would descend on the plant during an organizing drive. Their job was to engage workers in one-on-one conversations, often using sophisticated psychological techniques to identify worker concerns and turn them against the union. They would spread rumors, exploit existing divisions within the workforce, and paint a terrifying picture of what would happen if the union won. Their presence was designed to create an atmosphere of intense pressure and surveillance. The fourth and most illegal tactic was threats and retaliation. Although the National Labor Relations Act explicitly prohibits employers from threatening, coercing, or retaliating against workers for union activity, workers frequently reported such actions during Perdue organizing drives. Supervisors allegedly threatened workers with termination, loss of benefits, or even plant closure if they voted for the union. Pro-union workers reported being disciplined for minor infractions, moved to less desirable shifts or jobs, or simply fired under flimsy pretexts. While proving illegal retaliation can be difficult, the chilling effect was undeniable. Workers saw their pro-union colleagues targeted, and the message was clear: supporting the union could cost you your job. A stark example of this alleged strategy unfolded in 2023 at the company's flagship plant in Salisbury, Maryland. The United Food and Commercial Workers Local 27 launched a major organizing drive. The company responded with what the union described as a textbook anti-union campaign. Workers filed NLRB charges alleging mandatory captive audience meetings filled with misinformation, intense surveillance by supervisors, and the hiring of expensive union-busting consultants who roamed the plant floor engaging workers. The pressure culminated in a close vote where the union was ultimately defeated. UFCW Local 27 vowed to continue the fight, but the Salisbury campaign highlighted the immense resources Perdue was willing to deploy to remain union-free, even in its home state. This relentless anti-union posture had a direct impact on the company's bottom line and the lives of its workers. It kept wages low, benefits minimal, and perhaps most importantly, it suppressed the collective voice workers needed to demand safer conditions on the processing lines. The alleged wage collusion detailed in the antitrust lawsuits of the 2010s was the logical extension of this strategy. By allegedly sharing wage data with competitors like Tyson and Pilgrim's Pride, Perdue could ensure that even if workers did leave, they would find similarly low wages elsewhere, reinforcing the company's power and keeping labor costs suppressed across the entire industry. While the war against unions was fought inside the factory walls, Perdue waged a parallel, quieter, but equally effective war against the 3,500 contract farmers who raised its chickens. These farmers were on paper independent businessmen. In reality, they were locked into a system that critics like author Christopher Leonard in his book The Meat Racket described as a modern form of agricultural serfdom. The core of this system was the contract itself. To become a Perdue grower, a farmer had to agree to build massive, technologically advanced chicken houses according to Perdue's exact specifications. This often required taking on staggering levels of debt, frequently exceeding $1 million, often financed through loans implicitly guaranteed by the Perdue contract. The farmer owned the debt, the land, and the buildings. Perdue owned everything else that mattered: the chicks, the feed, the medication, the veterinary schedule, the pickup schedule, and, crucially, the final payment. The farmer was essentially a highly indebted manager on their own property, obligated to follow Perdue's dictates to the letter. Failure to comply, using the wrong type of bedding, deviating from the mandated feeding schedule, even adjusting the temperature in the houses without approval, could result in penalties or contract termination. The genius of this system, from Perdue's perspective, was the transfer of risk. If a disease swept through the flock, it was the farmer's loss. If a heat wave killed thousands of birds, it was the farmer's loss. If feed prices spiked, Perdue simply passed the cost on. The farmer absorbed nearly all the volatility inherent in agriculture. While Perdue enjoyed a predictable, low-cost supply of chickens, produced exactly to its specifications. But the true instrument of control, the psychological heart of the contract system, was the tournament system. This system, used by Perdue and most major poultry companies, determined how much a farmer was paid. It was deliberately opaque and inherently competitive. All the farmers who received chicks in a given week were grouped together. Over the next 6 to 8 weeks, their performance was tracked based on metrics dictated by Perdue, primarily feed conversion and mortality rate. At the end of the flock cycle, when Perdue collected the mature birds, the farmers in that group were ranked against each other. The top performers received a small bonus payment per pound of chicken delivered. The majority in the middle received the standard base pay. And the farmers who ranked at the bottom had their pay cut, sometimes significantly below the cost of production. This system was devastating for several reasons. First, it created intense competition between neighbors. Farmers were incentivized not to help each other, as another farmer's success could directly lower their own ranking and pay. This atomized the farming community, preventing them from organizing collectively to demand better contract terms. Second, the system was fundamentally unfair. Perdue controlled the two most critical inputs that determined a farmer's success: the quality of the chicks delivered and the quality of the feed. Farmers frequently complained that they would receive weak or sickly batches of chicks, or feed that seemed less effective, leading to poor weight gain and high mortality, factors entirely outside their control. Yet, they were the ones penalized in the tournament ranking. They suspected, though could rarely prove, that Perdue sometimes used the tournament to punish farmers who complained or were perceived as troublemakers. Third, the system created constant fear. A farmer knew that a single bad flock caused by bad chicks, bad feed, or simply bad luck could push them to the bottom of the tournament. Landing at the bottom repeatedly was grounds for contract termination. For a farmer carrying $1 million in specialized debt, tied to chicken houses that had no other agricultural use, termination was tantamount to bankruptcy. It meant losing not just their livelihood, but often their family farm itself. This fear enforced absolute compliance. Farmers learned quickly: do not question the flock supervisor. Do not complain about the feed. Do not speak to the press. Do not, under any circumstances, attempt to organize with other farmers. The quiet power of Perdue was maintained through the constant implicit threat of economic annihilation. Over the years, farmers did attempt to fight back, but the system was heavily stacked against them. Individual lawsuits alleging unfair contract practices, price manipulation, or retaliation were difficult and expensive to pursue. Perdue, with its army of corporate lawyers, won the vast majority of these cases. Attempts to form grower associations were often met with subtle or overt resistance from the company. In 2022, the Charlotte Observer newspaper documented a pattern of alleged retaliation. They found at least 20 cases where contract farmers across the South who had spoken out publicly about the tournament system, low pay, or environmental concerns had their contracts abruptly terminated by Perdue or other major poultry companies. The message was chillingly clear: dissent would not be tolerated. Advocacy groups like the Rural Advancement Foundation International and informal networks like Protect the Farmers emerged to support growers and lobby for contract reforms. They pushed for legislation that would increase transparency in the tournament system, provide farmers with more bargaining power and protect them from arbitrary contract termination. But they faced the immense lobbying power of Perdue and the broader poultry industry, represented by groups like the U.S. Poultry and Egg Association. Progress was slow and incremental. The combined effect of Perdue's anti-union warfare in its factories and its ironclad control over its contract farmers created a system of unparalleled efficiency and cost control. It allowed the company to produce chicken at a price point that reshaped the American diet, making chicken the most consumed meat in the country. But that efficiency came at a profound human cost. It was built on suppressing the wages and bargaining power of its factory workers, often trapping vulnerable immigrants in dangerous, low-paying jobs. And it was built on transforming independent American farmers into heavily indebted, fearful contractors, stripped of their autonomy and forced to compete in a rigged game. The quiet power of the Perdue Dynasty was, in reality, the power to silence dissent and dictate terms, ensuring that the relentless machine producing cheap chicken never stopped. A quiet family or a meat racket. Unlike the operatic sagas of dynasties like the Rockefellers, the Hearsts, or even the relatively obscure Bancrofts, the Perdue family history is marked by a conspicuous absence of public scandal. There are no lurid divorces splashed across tabloids, no bitter inheritance battles played out in open court, no rebellious heirs denouncing the family business. For 3 generations, the Perdues have maintained an almost monastic level of privacy, adhering rigidly to the quiet power culture established by the founder, Arthur W. Perdue. This intense insularity, however, is not a sign of internal harmony. Rather, it is the deliberate cultivation of an impenetrable facade, a shield that protects the family from scrutiny, while allowing them to perfect and perpetuate a business model that critics describe as one of the most sophisticated and exploitative systems of control in modern American agriculture, the meat racket. The architect of this system, and the man whose personality still looms large over the company, was Frank Perdue. The folksy, awkward man on the television commercials, the one who promised tenderness, was only one facet of a complex and reportedly ruthless individual. Frank inherited his father Arthur's work ethic and obsession with quality, but he lacked Arthur's inherent caution and perhaps his moral compass. Frank was driven by an ambition that bordered on the Napoleonic. He saw the chicken business not just as a way to make a living, but as a war to be won, a market to be conquered. His famous slogan, "It takes a tough man to make a tender chicken," was, according to those who worked closely with him, the literal truth. He was notoriously demanding, a micromanager who obsessed over every detail, from the color of the chicken's skin to the font on the packaging. He pushed his employees relentlessly, fostering a high-pressure corporate culture where meeting production quotas was paramount. His toughness was not just a marketing ploy, it was his management philosophy. A 2006 biography, while not a scandalous exposé, hinted at the personal demons that fueled this drive. It touched upon allegations of heavy drinking and a demanding, sometimes abrasive, personal style. While Frank maintained a carefully controlled public image, reports suggested a man who could be charming one moment and explosive the next. This intensity, while driving the company's phenomenal growth, also shaped its less savory aspects. His hardline anti-union stance, his willingness to aggressively exploit right-to-work laws, and his implementation of the psychologically brutal tournament system for farmers were all reflections of this tough man ethos. He believed in total control, and he achieved it through a combination of brilliant marketing and relentless pressure. Frank Perdue died in 2005 from lung cancer, leaving behind an $8 billion empire and a complex legacy. He had transformed American eating habits, built a beloved national brand, and amassed a staggering fortune. But he had also perfected a system that relied on squeezing profits from animals, workers, and farmers alike. His son, Jim Perdue, who took over as chairman in 1991, represented a stark generational shift. Where Frank was the gruff, self-made industrialist, Jim was the polished, educated corporate leader. He held a PhD in marine biology, a background that seemed utterly incongruous with the gritty realities of the poultry business. Jim lacked his father's abrasive charisma and his instinct for the jugular. He was quieter, more analytical, more comfortable in the boardroom than on the factory floor or the farm. This shift in leadership style initially led some observers to wonder if the company's culture would change. Would Jim Perdue, the scientist, soften his father's tough edges? Would he address the growing criticisms about animal welfare, worker safety, and farmer exploitation? The answer, it turned out, was both yes and no. Jim Perdue proved to be just as shrewd a businessman as his father, but his methods were different. He understood that the market was changing. He recognized the threat posed by the animal welfare movement and the growing consumer demand for clean food. His masterstroke was the No Antibiotics Ever initiative. This was not just a minor product tweak. It was a fundamental re-engineering of the entire Perdue supply chain, a massive gamble that positioned the company as an industry leader in response to public health concerns. Jim also understood the power of public relations in a way his father perhaps hadn't. Faced with the damaging undercover videos and lawsuits of the 2010s, Jim didn't just deny, he engaged. He implemented the highly publicized commitments to animal care. He opened the farms to tours. He even initiated dialogue with activist groups like Mercy for Animals. This was a sophisticated strategy of reputation management. He aimed to neutralize criticism by adopting the language of his critics, presenting Perdue not as a defensive corporate behemoth, but as a transparent, evolving, and responsible leader. The Perdue Foundation, the family's philanthropic arm, became a key part of this strategy. While critics like Pablo Eisenberg pointed out that the foundation's giving represented a minuscule fraction, less than 1% of the company's profits, its impact was strategically focused. The foundation poured millions into communities where Perdue operated, funding hospitals, schools, and local charities, particularly on the Delmarva Peninsula. This generated significant local goodwill and created a network of political and community allies, further insulating the company from criticism. Jim Perdue announced hundreds of millions in new community investments in the 2020s, burnishing the family's image as benevolent local patrons. But beneath this polished, modern, socially responsible surface, critics argued that the fundamental machinery of exploitation remained unchanged. The NAE initiative addressed antibiotics, but it did little to change the genetics of rapid growth that caused birds to suffer from leg deformities and heart failure. The commitments to animal care added windows to some barns, but didn't alter the extreme overcrowding or the brutal realities of transport and slaughter. The community donations generated goodwill, but didn't raise the wages of the immigrant workers on the processing lines. And most critically, the contract farming system, the bedrock of the Perdue model, remained firmly in place. This is where the family's quiet power continued to operate most effectively, and where the conflict, shielded from public view, remained most intense. Throughout the 2000s and 2010s, a steady stream of lawsuits were filed against Perdue by its own contract farmers. These lawsuits, often filed individually or in small groups due to the difficulty of organizing the isolated growers, painted a consistent picture of alleged abuse and manipulation. Farmers allege that Perdue used its monopoly power. In many rural areas, Perdue was the only buyer for chicken farmers to impose unfair contract terms. They claimed the company intentionally provided them with low-quality chicks or substandard feed, knowing this would hurt their performance in the tournament system and lower their pay. They accused Perdue's flock supervisors of using the tournament rankings punitively, downgrading farmers who dared to question company practices or speak out. They alleged that Perdue routinely underpaid them, using opaque weighing and calculation methods at the processing plant that farmers had no way to verify. Perdue consistently denied these allegations, arguing its contracts were fair and its tournament system rewarded efficiency. And armed with vastly superior legal resources, the company won the vast majority of these lawsuits. Courts often sided with the company, upholding the sanctity of the contracts the farmers had signed, even if those contracts left the farmers with little power or recourse. The legal system, critics argued, was ill-equipped to address the fundamental power imbalance inherent in the contract model. The farmers who did speak out often faced devastating consequences. As the Charlotte Observer documented in 2022, contract termination was the ultimate weapon. Farmers who complained to regulators, spoke to journalists, or simply pushed back too hard against their flock supervisors could find their contracts abruptly canceled. For a farmer carrying millions in debt for specialized chicken houses, termination was a death sentence. It meant almost certain bankruptcy and the potential loss of the family farm. This constant threat enforced a culture of silence far more effectively than any legal contract clause. This entire system, the contracts, the tournament, the debt, the fear, was meticulously dissected by journalist Christopher Leonard in his groundbreaking 2014 book, The Meat Racket: The Secret Takeover of America's Food Business. Leonard's book was not just about Perdue. It was an expose of the entire vertically integrated meat industry. But Perdue served as a central case study. Leonard argued that the term contract farming was itself a euphemism. The system pioneered by Frank Perdue and perfected by Jim Perdue was not a partnership. It was a racket. He compared the poultry companies to the feudal lords of the Middle Ages and the contract farmers to serfs, bound to the land by debt and obligated to serve their corporate masters. Leonard detailed how the companies used their control over genetics, feed, and processing to extract maximum profit while shifting maximum risk onto the growers. He exposed the manipulation inherent in the tournament system, showing how companies could allegedly use it to discipline farmers and suppress overall pay rates. He argued that this system was deliberately designed to prevent farmers from gaining any real economic power or independence. They were kept in a state of perpetual debt and dependence, ensuring a cheap, compliant source of chickens for the processing plants. The meat racket provided a powerful counter-narrative to Perdue's carefully crafted public image. It argued that the company's success was not just due to marketing or efficiency, but to the ruthless exploitation of the very farmers who formed the base of its supply chain. The book resonated deeply within agricultural communities and among food system reformers, providing a framework for understanding the hidden costs embedded in the price of cheap chicken. The Perdue family's response to Leonard's critique and to the ongoing complaints from farmers followed their established pattern: public silence combined with behind-the-scenes legal and political maneuvering. Jim Perdue rarely addressed the criticisms directly. The company continued to defend its contract system as fair and efficient. They pointed to the fact that thousands of farmers chose to sign contracts with Perdue as evidence of the system's viability. They highlighted the economic benefits the company brought to rural communities. Informal groups like Protect the Farmers continued to emerge, attempting to organize growers and provide a platform for their grievances. They accused Perdue of using its quiet power, its local political influence, its strategic philanthropy, its army of lawyers to systematically silence dissent and maintain its iron grip on the growers. But organizing farmers proved incredibly difficult. They were geographically dispersed, financially vulnerable, and deeply fearful of retaliation. Unlike factory workers gathered under one roof, the contract farmers remained largely isolated, making collective action almost impossible. The intense privacy of the Perdue family itself served as another layer of defense. Because there were no public family scandals, no internal power struggles spilling into the press, the focus remained solely on the company's actions. The family members, Jim Perdue, his children who were beginning to enter the business, and other relatives, remained largely invisible, shielded from direct public criticism. They were the beneficiaries of the racket, but they maintained a plausible deniability, allowing the corporate structure and its executives to absorb the negative attention. This combination, a ruthlessly efficient and exploitative business model, a sophisticated public relations apparatus, intense family privacy, and the aggressive suppression of worker and farmer dissent, formed the core of the Perdue Dynasty's enduring power. It was a system built not just on raising chickens, but on controlling information, managing perception, and ensuring that the true costs of their $8 billion empire remained largely hidden from the consumers who bought their products. What is the true price of cheap chicken? The Perdue Dynasty operates differently from the flamboyant empires of oil barons or media moguls. Theirs is not a power built on skyscrapers, headlines, or political office. It is a quieter, more granular, and perhaps more pervasive form of control, rooted in the soil of the Delmarva Peninsula and woven into the very fabric of America's food system. While critics have occasionally hurled sensational accusations, even alleging ties to organized crime, the true nature of Perdue's influence is less cinematic, but arguably more significant. It's a power derived from market dominance, political savvy, and the relentless systemic control over every link in the chain that brings chicken from the egg to the dinner table. This quiet power has allowed the family to shape regulations, suppress dissent, and build an $8 billion empire, largely shielded from the intense public scrutiny faced by more visible corporate giants. The most extreme and least substantiated allegations against the family surfaced during the height of PETA's confrontational campaigns against Frank Perdue in the 1980s. Facing a notoriously tough and unyielding opponent, PETA activists deployed aggressive tactics, including accusations that went beyond animal cruelty. Citing unnamed sources and internal rumors, PETA alleged that Frank Perdue had connections to New York organized crime figures, suggesting he had potentially used mob-affiliated unions or consultants to violently break strikes or intimidate critics. These explosive claims, linking the tough man of chicken to the actual mafia, generated headlines, but ultimately lacked concrete proof. No formal investigations or indictments ever materialized to support the allegations. While the mafia connection remains in the realm of unproven conspiracy theory, it speaks to the perception of ruthlessness that Frank Perdue cultivated. His documented anti-union activities, his hard-nosed business tactics, and his sheer dominance over the Delmarva region created an aura of untouchability. Whether or not he actually colluded with mobsters, the idea that he was plausible enough to serve as a potent weapon for his critics, painting him not just as a tough businessman, but as a potentially dangerous figure operating outside the bounds of ethical conduct. The family's actual demonstrable power operates through more conventional, though no less effective channels. Perdue Farms is a major political force, particularly at the state and local levels in the regions where it operates. Their lobbying expenditures, while perhaps modest compared to giants like ExxonMobil or Amazon, are strategically deployed and highly effective. Data compiled by organizations like Open Secrets consistently show Perdue spending hundreds of thousands of dollars each year on federal lobbying, targeting legislation related to agriculture, labor law, environmental regulations, and international trade, but their real clout lies closer to home. In states like Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, and North Carolina, Perdue is not just a company, it is an economic cornerstone. The thousands of jobs in their processing plants, the contracts with thousands of farmers, and the vast network of suppliers create an immense political gravity. Legislators in Annapolis, Dover, Raleigh, and Richmond are acutely aware of Perdue's economic footprint. The company and its executives are major donors to political campaigns, cultivating relationships with governors, state senators, and local officials. This influence translates into tangible policy outcomes. Perdue has been a key player in lobbying against stricter environmental regulations on the Chesapeake Bay watershed, where poultry farm runoff is a major source of pollution. They have fought successfully to maintain the right-to-work laws that cripple unions in the South, and they have consistently lobbied against measures that would give contract farmers more bargaining power or protect them from arbitrary contract termination. This political influence is amplified through powerful industry associations. Perdue is a dominant force within the U.S. Poultry and Egg Association and the National Chicken Council. These trade groups function as the industry's collective lobbying arm in Washington, D.C. They spend millions annually fighting regulations that could increase costs or impose stricter standards, particularly concerning animal welfare and worker safety. The decades-long battle over animal welfare standards is a prime example of this influence in action. When animal rights groups began pushing for federal legislation mandating more humane treatment, such as minimum space requirements, access to enrichments, or stricter slaughter protocols, the USPEA and NCC, with Perdue as a key member, mounted a massive counteroffensive. They argued that such regulations were unnecessary, scientifically unsound, and would drive up the cost of chicken, hurting consumers. They successfully lobbied Congress to delay, weaken, or kill numerous animal welfare bills over the years. They also heavily influenced the USDA's own voluntary guidelines, ensuring that standards like those used for the humanely raised label remained closely aligned with existing, often inadequate, industry practices. This quiet, persistent lobbying war, waged largely behind the scenes in Washington, was far more effective at protecting Perdue's interests than any public relations campaign. Perdue also cultivates influence through partnerships with academic institutions and think tanks. They fund agricultural research at universities, often focusing on efficiency, genetics, and disease prevention, areas that directly benefit their bottom line. They participate in USDA advisory committees, giving them a direct voice in shaping federal agricultural policy. This creates a subtle but powerful feedback loop where the industry's priorities become intertwined with the government's research agenda and regulatory framework. Critics argue that this entire apparatus, the lobbying, the campaign donations, the industry associations, The academic partnerships constitutes a form of regulatory capture, where the industry being regulated effectively controls the regulators. They contend that agencies like the USDA often act more like partners to companies like Perdue than as independent watchdogs protecting the public interest. This critique extends to the family's philanthropy. While the Perdue Foundation donates millions to local communities, philanthropic experts like Pablo Eisenberg have pointed out that this giving represents a tiny fraction, estimated at less than 1%, of the company's multi-billion-dollar profits. Eisenberg and others argue that this strategic, localized charity functions primarily as a tool for building goodwill and maintaining quiet power in the communities where Perdue operates. It creates a network of grateful allies, hospital boards, school principals, local politicians who are less likely to criticize the company or support regulations that might harm its interests. The philanthropy, critics contend, is not altruism. It is a calculated investment in maintaining the status quo. The ultimate manifestation of Perdue's power, however, lies in the market itself. The antitrust lawsuits filed against Perdue and its competitors in the 2000s were not just about illegal collusion. They were fundamentally about the consequences of extreme market concentration. The poultry industry, dominated by just 4 giant companies, had allegedly become an oligopoly, a market where a few powerful players could implicitly or explicitly coordinate their actions to control prices and suppress competition. The lawsuits alleged 2 primary forms of collusion. First, they accused the companies of conspiring to fix, raise, and stabilize the price of broiler chickens sold to supermarkets, restaurants, and food service companies. Using sophisticated data-sharing services like AgriStats, the companies allegedly exchanged detailed information on production levels, capacity, and pricing, allowing them to coordinate supply cuts and keep prices artificially high. This alleged conspiracy, plaintiffs argued, harmed consumers by inflating the cost of chicken. Second, the lawsuits accused the companies of colluding to suppress the wages of their factory workers. By allegedly sharing granular data on hourly wages, salaries, and benefits through secret surveys, the companies could ensure they were all offering similarly low compensation packages. This prevented workers from leveraging job offers from one company to demand higher wages from another, effectively trapping the entire workforce in a low-wage equilibrium. This alleged wage collusion disproportionately harmed the vulnerable immigrant workers who made up the majority of the processing line workforce. While Perdue, like its competitors, denied the allegations and settled many of the lawsuits without admitting wrongdoing, the cases shone a harsh light on the immense market power wielded by Big Chicken. This was not the invisible hand of the free market at work. It was, critics argued, the heavy hand of corporate consolidation, squeezing profits from consumers, workers, and farmers alike. Economic historians and critics of corporate power, drawing on the warnings of figures like Ben Bagdikian, see the Perdue story not as a unique conspiracy, but as a textbook example of the dangers inherent in unchecked industrial capitalism, particularly in the food system. The relentless drive for efficiency, vertical integration, and market share, they argue, inevitably leads to consolidation. This consolidation creates powerful oligopolies that can dictate terms to suppliers, exploit labor, manipulate prices, and capture regulatory agencies. In this view, the Perdues, Arthur, Frank, and Jim, were not necessarily evil geniuses plotting world domination. They were simply exceptionally successful practitioners of a ruthless business model, a model that prioritized shareholder value and market control above all else. The animal cruelty, the worker exploitation, the farmer bankruptcies, and the environmental degradation were not unfortunate side effects. They were, critics contend, the predictable and necessary outcomes of that model. They were the hidden costs baked into the artificially low price of industrial chicken. The question facing the Perdue Dynasty today is whether this model is sustainable. The 2024 settlement with the Department of Labor over child labor violations, which resulted in significant fines, part of a $3.8 million multi-company agreement, and mandated third-party audits, suggests that regulatory scrutiny is increasing. Ongoing lawsuits from farmers challenging the contract system indicate that grower discontent remains high. Consumer awareness of animal welfare issues, while perhaps slow to translate into mass purchasing changes, continues to grow, fueled by the relentless work of activist groups armed with cameras. Jim Perdue and the fourth generation now entering the business face a strategic crossroads. They can continue the quiet power strategy of their ancestors, relying on lobbying, public relations, and legal maneuvering to defend the status quo. Or they can choose a path of genuine transformation, fundamentally altering the company's relationship with its animals, its workers, and its farmers, even if it means sacrificing some measure of control and potentially raising the price of their product. The final verdict on the Perdue Dynasty is still being written. They are not global conspirators in the mold of a fictional shadow government. Their power is more tangible, rooted in the specific economics and politics of American agriculture. But it is no less significant for being localized. Through 3 generations of relentless focus, the Perdue family built a machine that feeds millions, employs thousands, and generates billions. They achieved the American dream on an industrial scale. But the enduring legacy of that achievement is inseparable from the costs it imposed: the suffering of animals, the exploitation of workers, the crushing of farmers, and the consolidation of a quiet, pervasive power over a fundamental part of the nation's food supply. The story of Perdue is ultimately the story of the true price of cheap chicken.